Parthenia's hands trembled as she held the heirloom quilt above Sophronia Blackwell's sleeping face. Moonlight filtered through the gauze curtains of the stifling bedroom, transforming the quilt's embroidered silk into something that seemed to breathe and pulse in her grip. The patterns, centuries-old roses intertwined with thorn vines, appeared to writhe in the pale light, and for a moment, just a moment, Parthenia could have sworn she saw faces hidden within the stitches, mouths open in silent screams. Her mistress lay beneath her, laudanum deep in sleep, her chest rising and falling with the labored breath of the consumptive. The August heat pressed down on them both like a suffocating hand, and somewhere in the darkness of the plantation house, a floorboard creaked. Parthenia's fingers tightened on the quilt's edges. She had only to lower it. Just lower it, and press down, and everything would change forever. But we must go back. Back to when the sun still hung merciless over the Mississippi River, back to the moment Parthenia first saw the blood. It was earlier that same sweltering day when she discovered it while preparing Mistress Sophronia's chamber for the afternoon rest. The Blackwell plantation house rose 3 stories above the river bluffs near Memphis, Tennessee, a monument to wealth built on the backs of enslaved labor and the blood money of cotton. The house was Gothic in its pretensions, all dark wood and darker corners, with windows that seemed to swallow light rather than admit it. Moss grew on the north-facing walls despite the household's best efforts, and the place carried a perpetual smell of decay masked by lavender and rosewater, as if the house itself were a beautiful corpse being prepared for viewing. Parthenia had been preparing the room as she did every day, opening the windows to air that provided no relief, only the thick humidity that rolled up from the river like a curse. She was smoothing the sheets on the 4-poster bed when her fingers found dampness on the quilt. At first, she thought it was merely sweat, everything was damp in this heat. But when she lifted her hand, her fingertips were stained rust-red. Blood. She pulled the quilt fully into the light streaming through the window, and her breath caught in her throat. There were stains scattered across the silk surface, dark russet patches that seemed to seep from within the very fabric itself. These weren't fresh bloodstains, the kind that came from a cut finger or a lady's monthly courses. These were old, impossibly old, emerging from the stitches as if the quilt were weeping its own history. The quilt was a masterwork of needlecraft, created over 100 years prior by hands long dead. Its surface was a garden of embroidered roses in silk thread, crimson, white, and the deep purple of old bruises. Thorned vines twisted between the blooms in patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their menace. The backing was ivory silk that had yellowed with age, and the batting between felt unnaturally heavy, as if something more than cotton had been sewn inside. It had been a wedding gift to the first Blackwell bride when she arrived from Virginia in 1738, though no one spoke of who had made it or why. Parthenia knew the quilt's history because Sophronia had told her, over and over, during the long fevered nights when the mistress couldn't sleep and needed someone to hear her fears. Every Blackwell bride had been given this quilt on her wedding night. Every Blackwell bride had died young. The first bride, Lavinia Blackwell, had died in childbirth with the quilt wrapped around her, strangled by her own umbilical cord in a grotesque mirror of the child she was trying to birth. The second bride, Constance, had been found one morning in the garden, the quilt draped over her shoulders, her lips blue from some poison that was never identified. The third bride had simply stopped breathing one night, the quilt pulled up to her chin, her face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. There had been others, 5 brides in total before Sophronia, and each had met her end with this quilt somewhere nearby, as if it called to them in their final moments. Sophronia was the 6th bride, and she was dying slowly. Consumption was eating her from the inside out, turning her into a wraith of fury and paranoia. Some nights she begged Parthenia to burn the quilt. Other nights she clutched it to her chest and wept, saying it was the only thing that brought her comfort. The quilt had become an obsession, a presence in the house that demanded attention and inspired dread in equal measure. Parthenia stared at the blood seeping through the stitches, and a cold certainty settled over her despite the oppressive heat. The quilt wanted something. It had always wanted something. She had been enslaved to this house since she was 8 years old, taken from her mother's arms to serve as personal maid to young Sophronia, who was then a girl of 10 with cruel eyes and a crueler mouth. They had grown up together in this house of shadows, separated by an unbridgeable chasm of power and skin color, yet forced into an intimacy more profound than marriage. Parthenia knew every secret of Sophronia's body, the moles on her back, the way her left hip ached when rain was coming, the smell of her breath in the morning. She knew, too, the secrets of Sophronia's soul, or what passed for a soul in a woman who had been raised to view human beings as property. Master Cornelius Blackwell was away in Memphis on business, as he often was, leaving his dying wife in the care of the woman she both depended on and despised. The house felt emptier without him, though his presence was hardly a comfort. Cornelius was a man of appetites and ambitions, with eyes that lingered too long and hands that took what they wanted. There were whispers about his first wife, the one before Sophronia, the one who had died suddenly after a brief illness that left her screaming about shadows in the night. The plantation sprawled across 500 acres of river-bottom land, worked by nearly 200 enslaved souls who lived in conditions that made the decaying grandeur of the main house seem obscene by comparison. Parthenia was one of the fortunate ones, if fortune could be measured in such a place. She slept in a small room off the kitchen, not in the quarters. She wore the mistress's cast-off dresses, altered to fit her smaller frame. She could read, having taught herself from the books in Master Cornelius's library during the long hours she spent dusting while he was away. She knew she was fortunate, and she hated herself for thinking it. She folded the quilt with careful hands, feeling the weight of it, the unnatural heaviness that seemed to increase with each fold. The blood had disappeared when she looked again, leaving only the faintest discoloration that could have been shadows or age or her imagination. But Parthenia knew what she had seen. The quilt was showing her something, warning her or inviting her, she couldn't tell which. That afternoon, Sophronia woke from her rest in a foul mood, her face flushed with fever and rage. She demanded water, then threw the glass against the wall when it wasn't cold enough. She wanted the windows closed because the river air was making her cough, then open because she was suffocating. She pulled Parthenia's hair when the hairbrush caught on a tangle, yanking hard enough to bring tears. Through it all, Parthenia maintained the blank expression she had perfected over 17 years of servitude, her face a mask that revealed nothing of the fire building behind her eyes. As evening fell and the heat barely diminished, Sophronia demanded the quilt be placed on her bed, even though the temperature made any covering unbearable. Parthenia spread it across the mattress, smoothing the embroidered roses with hands that wanted to tear the fabric to shreds. She felt the weight of it, the way it seemed to sink into the bed as if it had roots that reached down through the floor and into the earth itself, drawing up something dark and old and hungry. If you're drawn to tales of historical darkness and human desperation, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell so you never miss a story that will keep you awake at night. Drop a comment below, do you believe some objects carry the weight of evil deeds? That night, after Sophronia had finally fallen into laudanum-assisted sleep, Parthenia stood at the window of her small room and looked out over the plantation grounds. The Mississippi River glowed like molten silver in the moonlight, beautiful and indifferent to the suffering on its banks. She thought about the quilt upstairs, covering her mistress like a shroud. She thought about the blood she had seen, and about all the Blackwell brides who had died young, and about the enslaved women who must have created such a masterwork of needlecraft. What had they stitched into those roses and vines? What curses had they whispered over each careful stitch? What rage had they folded into the batting, pressed between layers of silk and cotton and time? Parthenia touched the burned scar on her left forearm, a souvenir from when she was 12 and had spilled hot tea on Sophronia's lap. The mistress had held Parthenia's arm against the stove as punishment, counting to 10 in a pleasant voice while Parthenia bit through her own lip to keep from screaming. The scar was raised and shiny, a permanent reminder of her place in this house. She climbed the servants' stairs in darkness, her feet knowing every creaking board, every loose nail. The house settled around her with groans and whispers, as if the walls themselves were restless. Outside Sophronia's door, she paused, listening to the labored breathing within. Then she turned the handle and entered. The room was bathed in moonlight, turning everything silver and strange. Sophronia lay on her back, the quilt pulled up to her chest, her face peaceful in sleep in a way it never was in waking. The embroidered roses seemed to move in the shifting light, the thorned vines appearing to tighten around the blooms. Parthenia approached the bed slowly, and as she did, she could have sworn she heard voices, whispers in a language she didn't know, but whose meaning she understood in her bones. The quilt was speaking, and it was saying yes, yes, yes. She lifted the quilt with trembling hands, feeling its weight, its hunger. This was the moment. This was the threshold. Once crossed, there would be no return, no redemption, only the terrible freedom that comes from becoming the monster your oppressors always claimed you were. Sophronia stirred but didn't wake, lost in her drugged dreams. The quilt hung between them like a silk curtain separating the world of the living from the world of the dead. And Parthenia realized, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that she had already decided. But Parthenia did not lower the quilt that night. Not yet. She stood frozen in that moonlit moment, the weight of the quilt in her hands and the weight of 17 years of captivity pressing down on her soul, and then she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, smoothing the quilt back over Sophronia's sleeping form, arranging the folds just so, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The footsteps passed, just old Jessamine making her rounds, and Parthenia slipped from the room like a ghost, leaving behind only the faint scent of the lye soap she used to wash her hands raw every night. She returned to her small room and did not sleep. Instead, she lay on her narrow bed and remembered how it had begun, this twisted intimacy that bound her to Sophronia more tightly than any chain. Parthenia had been 8 years old when Master Cornelius purchased her mother from a failing plantation in Nashville. Her mother, Delilah, had been a skilled seamstress, and Cornelius had wanted someone to maintain the household linens and alter Sophronia's endless parade of dresses. Parthenia had clung to her mother's skirts during the long journey to the Blackwell plantation, not understanding that she was being brought not as a child but as an investment, a playmate and servant for the master's young bride. Sophronia had been 10 years old then, already beautiful in the way of porcelain dolls, with skin so pale it seemed translucent and hair the color of corn silk. She had also been lonely in that vast house overlooking the river, her own family far away in Charleston, her husband nearly 30 years her senior and often absent. When Parthenia was presented to her as a gift, for that was how Master Cornelius had phrased it, a little maid of your very own, Sophronia's face had lit up with a hunger that Parthenia would come to know intimately over the years that followed. At first, it had almost seemed like friendship. They were two girls in a house full of adults, and children have a remarkable ability to forget the circumstances that separate them when they want companionship badly enough. They played with Sophronia's dolls in the nursery. They raided the kitchen for stolen sweets, though Parthenia was always the one who received lashes when they were caught. They whispered secrets in the dark, though Sophronia's secrets were about which boys she would marry someday, while Parthenia's secrets were about which stars her mother had taught her to navigate by, back when navigation had meant something other than finding her way through the endless hallways of this house. But childhood games cannot last when one child owns the other. As they grew, the pretense of friendship curdled into something else, a forced intimacy that was both more and less than love, a dependence that bred contempt alongside need. Sophronia came to rely on Parthenia for everything, dressing her, bathing her, braiding her hair, reading to her, sleeping at the foot of her bed when nightmares came. Parthenia knew the texture of Sophronia's skin, the pattern of freckles on her shoulders, the way her breath smelled sweet in the morning and sour at night. She knew that Sophronia cried after Cornelius visited her bed, silent tears that soaked into the pillowcase. She knew about the laudanum that Sophronia had started taking after the stillborn baby, the one that had nearly killed her and left her unable to bear more children. She knew about the illness that came after, the consumption that was eating Sophronia alive from the inside, turning her into a creature of fever dreams and rage. And Sophronia, for her part, knew Parthenia in ways that were equally invasive. She knew when Parthenia had her monthly courses before Parthenia did, monitoring her body with the attention of a farmer watching valuable livestock. She knew about the boy in the quarters that Parthenia had loved when she was 14, knew and had him sold away to a plantation in Mississippi before anything could come of it. She knew that Parthenia could read, had discovered her with a book one afternoon and beaten her with it until the spine broke, then made Parthenia continue reading aloud through split lips because Sophronia wanted to know how the story ended. This was the intimacy of captivity, knowing someone completely and being known completely in return, without the grace of choice or the mercy of distance. They were bound together more closely than most husbands and wives, yet separated by a chasm that no amount of proximity could bridge. The consumption had made everything worse. As Sophronia's body weakened, her cruelty intensified, as if she needed to prove her power over someone, anyone, before death stole it away entirely. The illness had begun 2 years ago, shortly after the stillbirth, and the doctors Cornelius brought from Memphis could do nothing but prescribe laudanum and fresh air. The fresh air from the river seemed only to make Sophronia's coughing worse, racking her thin frame until blood flecked her lips. The laudanum made her paranoid, seeing conspiracies in every shadow. She became convinced that Cornelius was trying to poison her, just as she believed he had poisoned his first wife. This first wife was never spoken of in the house, but Sophronia had told Parthenia the story late one night, her eyes glittering with fever and fear. The first wife had been healthy, robust even, and then suddenly she had fallen ill with mysterious symptoms, seeing things that weren't there, screaming about shadows that crawled up from the floorboards, convulsing until her spine nearly broke. She had died in agony, and 3 months later Cornelius had married the young Sophronia. The first wife's death had been attributed to brain fever, but Sophronia knew better. She had found papers, receipts for substances that had no medical purpose. She had overheard conversations between Cornelius and the overseer about what could and couldn't be traced. She knew, and the knowing was eating her alive alongside the consumption. But Sophronia's paranoia extended beyond her husband. She became obsessed with the idea that the enslaved people of the plantation were plotting against her, that they whispered curses and stuck pins in dolls made of corn husk and Spanish moss. She demanded that Parthenia taste her food before she would eat it. She made Parthenia sleep not just in her room but chained to the foot of the bed, like a dog that might run away in the night. She struck Parthenia for imagined infractions, a look held too long, a word spoken in the wrong tone, a perceived hesitation in following orders. The violence was arbitrary and constant. Last week, Sophronia had become convinced that Parthenia had stolen a cameo brooch. She had not asked if Parthenia had taken it, she had simply picked up the silver hairbrush from her vanity and struck Parthenia across the face with it, opening a gash above her eyebrow that still throbbed when Parthenia moved too quickly. The brooch had been found later in Sophronia's own jewelry box, exactly where she had placed it. There had been no apology, only a demand that Parthenia clean the blood from the carpet and then sit beside Sophronia's bed while the mistress wept and insisted that the illness was making her confused, that she didn't mean to be cruel, that Parthenia must understand how frightened she was of dying. And Parthenia did understand, in the way that a prisoner understands the fear of the executioner who will nevertheless tighten the noose. Understanding did nothing to diminish the rage that grew inside her like a second heart, beating alongside the first. 2 days ago, there had been an incident that had shown Parthenia just how precarious her position had become. Sophronia had been in one of her moods, demanding that the room be rearranged, that the furniture be moved to different walls because the current arrangement allowed shadows to gather in threatening ways. Parthenia had been pushing the heavy wardrobe when her hand slipped, and the corner of the wardrobe had knocked against the bedpost, jostling the bed where Sophronia sat. It was nothing, barely a tremor, but Sophronia had shrieked as if she'd been struck. Before Parthenia could apologize, Sophronia had seized the candle from the bedside table and grabbed Parthenia's wrist with surprising strength for someone so ill. Clumsy, Sophronia had hissed, and pressed the lit candle against the back of Parthenia's hand, holding it there while Parthenia bit down on her own tongue to keep from screaming, knowing that screaming would only make it worse. Sophronia had counted to 5, slowly, her eyes never leaving Parthenia's face, watching for the moment when the pain would break through the mask. When she finally released Parthenia's wrist, she had smiled, actually smiled, and said in a voice as sweet as poisoned honey, "Now clean that up. You're making a mess." The burn was still fresh, the skin blistered and weeping. Parthenia had wrapped it in clean cloth, but it throbbed with every heartbeat, a constant reminder of her powerlessness. That night, As she had tended to the wound in her small room, she had thought about the quilt for the first time not as an object of dread but as a tool, a weapon that history had placed in her hands. She thought about her younger brother, Obadiah, who worked in the fields and who had recently been heard singing songs about freedom, foolish songs that could get him killed. She thought about her mother, dead these 5 years from a fever that a doctor would have been called to treat if the patient had been white. She thought about the 17 years she had spent in service to a woman who saw her as less than human, as a thing to be used and broken and used again. She thought about the future that stretched before her, decades more of this, until she was old Jessamine's age, bent and tired and still bowing and scraping, or until Sophronia's paranoia finally turned lethal and had her sold away or worse. And she thought about the quilt, with its embroidered roses and its history of dead brides and its weight that seemed to increase whenever she touched it. The quilt that had bled for her, showing her its secrets. The quilt that whispered in languages she didn't know but somehow understood. The quilt that had been waiting, patient as death itself, for someone angry enough and desperate enough to use it for its intended purpose. Parthenia realized, as dawn broke over the Mississippi and the heat of another unbearable day began to build, that she had been chosen by the quilt just as surely as those long-dead women had chosen her when they stitched their rage into silk. She was not the first to hold murder in her heart while smoothing that quilt over a sleeping mistress. She would not be the last. But she would be the one who finally acted, who finally let the quilt fulfill the purpose for which it had been created all those years ago. The decision, once made, brought a strange calm. Parthenia rose, washed her face and hands, and prepared herself to face another day of service and suffering. But now there was a difference. Now she was not merely surviving. She was waiting for her moment, and when it came, she would be ready. The quilt would show her when. The moment came 3 days later, though not in the way Parthenia expected. Sophronia, in a fit of coughing so violent it brought up blood, had torn the quilt in her thrashing. A section near the bottom corner had ripped along a seam, exposing the batting beneath and unraveling several of the embroidered roses. When the coughing fit finally subsided, leaving Sophronia gasping and exhausted against her pillows, she had looked at the damaged quilt with an expression of pure terror. "Fix it," she had whispered, her voice hoarse and desperate. "You must fix it, Parthenia. Before nightfall. It must be perfect before I sleep again." And so Parthenia found herself alone in the late afternoon light with the quilt spread across her lap, a needle and thread in her burned hand, and the opportunity to examine the thing more closely than she ever had before. She sat in the corner of Sophronia's room while the mistress dozed fitfully, medicated with laudanum, and began the work of repair. The tear revealed things that should not have been there. As Parthenia carefully separated the damaged layers, she found that the batting was not entirely cotton, as it should have been. Woven throughout the white fibers were strands of something else, something dark and coarse that she realized, with a cold shock of recognition, was human hair. Not just a few strands that might have fallen in during construction, but deliberate inclusions, braided and knotted into the cotton, creating a hidden web throughout the quilt's interior. The hair was various shades, black, brown, gray, as if it had been collected from many different women over time. Parthenia's needle hesitated. She looked toward Sophronia, confirming the woman was deeply asleep, then carefully pulled more of the torn section apart. Beneath the top layer of embroidered silk, she could now see that the stitching formed patterns that were invisible from the surface. When she held the fabric up to the window light, she could make out shapes hidden in the dense needlework, not flowers and vines, but faces. Dozens of faces, stitched so small and fine that they disappeared into the overall pattern unless you knew to look for them. The faces were African, the features unmistakable, and every single one had its mouth open in what could have been a scream or a song or a curse. The needlework was extraordinary, the kind of skill that took decades to master, and it had all been hidden, camouflaged beneath the acceptable beauty of roses and thorns. Her hands trembling now with something other than fear, Parthenia examined the embroidered roses more closely. What she had always taken for thorns on the vines, she now realized, were tiny symbols, marks that looked like the conjure signs old Jessamine sometimes scratched in the dirt outside the kitchen door, the ones she claimed her grandmother had brought from Africa. There were crescents and crosses, spirals and stars, all worked so seamlessly into the decorative pattern that no one would notice unless they were looking. This quilt was not merely a wedding gift. It was a piece of conjure so powerful and so dangerous that its creators had risked everything to make it. Parthenia felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went deeper than thought. The women who had made this quilt, enslaved women, certainly, forced to create something beautiful for their oppressors, had stitched their own power into every thread. They had taken what tools they were allowed and turned them into weapons. They had smiled and bowed and said yes ma'am while their needles wove curses into silk. They had created a legacy of rage disguised as domesticity, and it had been working its purpose for 100 years, claiming Blackwell bride after Blackwell bride, patient as the grave. She thought of her mother, Delilah, who had been a master seamstress, who had known stitches and patterns that she claimed went back generations, who had sometimes hummed while she worked, songs without words that seemed to come from somewhere deep and old. Had her mother known about quilts like this? Had she perhaps made such things herself, encoding resistance in the only language she was allowed to speak? Before we continue with what happened next, take a moment to like this video if this story is sending shivers down your spine, and share your thoughts in the comments. Would you touch an heirloom with such a dark history? Parthenia set down her needle and walked to the door, checking the hallway. Empty. She returned to the quilt and made a decision. She would not simply repair it. She would add to it. She would become part of its history, another woman adding her voice to the chorus of the silenced. From her pocket, she pulled a small knife she used for cutting thread. She pressed the blade against her thumb until blood welled up, bright and red. Then, working quickly, she let 3 drops fall onto the white silk backing of the quilt, watching as they soaked into the fabric and disappeared, as if the quilt were drinking them. She took a strand of her own hair, pulled free with a sharp tug that made her eyes water, and began to work it into the batting where the tear had exposed the interior. As she did, she whispered words that came from somewhere she didn't quite understand, words that might have been prayer or curse or both. I add my voice to yours, she whispered. I add my rage to yours. I add my hand to yours. Let this quilt do what it was meant to do. Let it be the shroud that smothers. Let it be the weight that ends breath. Let it take what has been taken from us. The room grew colder despite the August heat. The light from the window seemed to dim, though the sun had not moved. From somewhere far away, or perhaps from very close, Parthenia heard something that might have been wind or might have been women's voices, singing in harmony. The quilt in her lap felt heavier, denser, as if her words had added not just intention but actual mass to it. When she looked down at the embroidered surface, she could have sworn the roses had darkened from crimson to the deep purple-black of old blood. She worked through the afternoon, repairing the tear with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, adding her own small symbols to the pattern where no one but someone like her would think to look. She stitched a crescent moon, for secrets and hidden things. She stitched a closed fist, for the resistance she had held inside for 17 years. She stitched a bird in flight, for the freedom she might never have but could at least give to others. And with each stitch, she felt the quilt respond, as if it recognized her, as if it had been waiting for her specifically. When she was nearly finished, she heard footsteps approaching. She quickly secured her final stitch and folded the quilt just as old Jessamine entered the room, carrying a tray with Sophronia's evening medicine. Jessamine was perhaps 60 years old, though her exact age was unknown even to herself. She had been on the Blackwell plantation longer than anyone, had served 3 generations of the family, and had survived through a combination of usefulness and the ability to keep her thoughts hidden behind a mask of servility. But now, seeing Parthenia with the quilt, something flickered in the old woman's eyes. "You've been working on that quilt," Jessamine said quietly, setting down the tray. It wasn't a question. "Mistress tore it," Parthenia replied, keeping her voice neutral. "She asked me to repair it." Jessamine moved closer, her arthritic fingers reaching out to touch the silk surface. For a long moment, she said nothing, just ran her hands over the embroidered roses, her lips moving silently as if she were reading something written there. Then she looked up at Parthenia, and her eyes were ancient and knowing. "My grandmother worked on this quilt," Jessamine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before I was born, when she was young and strong and full of rage. She told me about it, before they sold her away. Said she and 5 other women worked on it for months, taking turns, each one adding her own piece. They was making a wedding gift for the first Blackwell bride, the master's new wife from Virginia. But what they was really making was justice." Parthenia's heart hammered in her chest. "What kind of justice?" "The patient kind," Jessamine said. "The kind that waits. My grandmother, she was a root worker, learned the craft from her own mother back in Africa. She knew things. She knew you couldn't fight power with nothing but your bare hands. But you could fight it with will and time and the right kind of working. So they made this quilt, and they put into it every hurt, every loss, every child sold away, every woman used, every man hanged. They wove it all in with the cotton and the silk and their own hair, and they stitched symbols into it that would call down what needed to be called down. They blessed it and cursed it both, made it beautiful enough that the white folks would treasure it, and deadly enough that it would do its work slow and sure. And it has," Parthenia breathed. "Every bride. Every bride that slept under it," Jessamine confirmed. "My grandmother said the quilt would know who deserved its attention. It wouldn't harm the innocent, if such a thing exists in this place. But those with blood on their hands, those who perpetuated the suffering, the quilt would find them. It would wait until the time was right, and then it would smother the breath out of them, so gentle they'd think it was just sleep coming for them, until it was too late." Parthenia looked down at the quilt in her lap, at the repairs she had made, at the new stitches that now included her own blood and hair and intention. "Why are you telling me this?" Jessamine's expression was unreadable. "Because I see what's in your eyes. I seen it building these past weeks. And I want you to know, if the quilt calls to you, if it shows you what needs doing, you ain't the first. You won't be the last. And the women who made this, they'd be proud to have you carry on their work." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing. The quilt protects its own. Anyone who uses it for its true purpose, the quilt keeps their secret. Every bride been found peaceful in their sleep, natural as can be. No suspicion, no investigation. The quilt knows how to hide what it does." Then she was gone, leaving Parthenia alone with the sleeping Sophronia and the quilt that now felt like it was breathing in her hands, alive with purpose and power and the accumulated rage of a century. Parthenia carefully spread the quilt back over her mistress, smoothing it with reverent hands. The repairs were invisible, but she could feel where she had added her own voice to the chorus of resistance stitched into the silk. That night, as she lay in her small room trying to sleep, Parthenia heard singing. It came from far away and very close, voices in harmony, women's voices raised in a song that had no words but infinite meaning. She knew, without knowing how she knew, that these were the voices of the quilt's makers, welcoming her into their number, acknowledging that she had become part of their legacy. The quilt was ready. The only question now was whether Parthenia was ready to use it. Master Cornelius Blackwell returned from Memphis 3 days after Parthenia repaired the quilt, and he brought with him the smell of whiskey, river mud, and decisions that would destroy what little remained of Parthenia's world. She heard his horse on the drive while she was helping Sophronia dress for the afternoon, heard the heavy boots on the stairs, heard the particular cadence of his walk, confident, entitled, the stride of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. Sophronia heard it too, and her thin body went rigid beneath Parthenia's hands. "He's back," Sophronia whispered, and there was something in her voice that made Parthenia look up. Fear, yes, but also a kind of bitter satisfaction, as if she had been expecting something and now it had arrived. "It's begun." Before Parthenia could ask what she meant, Cornelius was at the door. He was a large man, 48 years old, with the florid complexion of someone who drank too much and the thick hands of someone who was not afraid to use them. His hair was still mostly dark, though gray streaked the temples, and his eyes were the pale blue of winter ice. He barely glanced at Parthenia as he entered. She was furniture to him, a useful object but not worthy of actual notice. "Wife," he said to Sophronia, and the word carried no warmth. "I trust you're well." "As well as can be expected for someone dying," Sophronia replied, her voice sharp despite its weakness. "Did you conclude your business successfully?" Something passed across Cornelius's face, a flicker of satisfaction that made Parthenia's stomach tighten with instinctive dread. "Indeed. Very successfully. We'll discuss it after supper. Parthenia, leave us." Parthenia curtsied and left, but she did not go far. She had learned long ago that the things white people said when they thought no one was listening were the things that determined the fate of everyone under their control. She positioned herself in the hallway, in the shadowed alcove near the linen closet where she could hear through the door Cornelius had not quite closed. Her heart pounded as she listened to the murmur of voices, Cornelius's deep and measured, Sophronia's rising with agitation. "You cannot be serious," Sophronia was saying. "Surely there were other options." "There were no other options," Cornelius interrupted. "The cotton market is in flux, the railroad investment has not paid out as expected, and we have expenses that must be met. I've sold 20 of them. Good price, too. They leave in 2 weeks for the Fontaine plantation in Louisiana." Parthenia's blood turned to ice. 20 people. 20 souls ripped from their families, their homes, sent to Louisiana where the conditions were known to be brutal, where people died in the sugar fields like flies in winter. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Who would he sell? The field hands were valuable, but they were also necessary for the harvest. The house servants. Her stomach clenched. Obadiah. Her younger brother was 17, strong, healthy, exactly the kind of slave who would fetch a good price. "And you did this without consulting me?" Sophronia's voice was shrill now. "These people are, some of them have been here for generations." "These people are property," Cornelius said coldly. "And I will dispose of my property as I see fit. You concern yourself with dying gracefully and leave the business of this plantation to me." There was a crash, something thrown against a wall. "You bastard," Sophronia hissed. "You think I don't know? You think I'm blind as well as ill? You were in Memphis conducting business. What kind of business? The kind that wears silk dresses and perfume? The kind that waits for you in rooms above the tavern?" Parthenia heard Cornelius's laugh, dark and ugly. "At least she doesn't cough blood onto the pillows. At least she doesn't make me feel like I'm betting a corpse." The sound of a slap echoed through the door, followed by Sophronia's voice, raw with rage and pain. "I know what you did to your first wife. I know about the arsenic you bought from that apothecary in Natchez. I know about the symptoms, the visions, the convulsions. I have the receipts, Cornelius. I have the letters. If anything happens to me, if I die before my time, I've arranged for certain documents to be delivered to the sheriff." "You've done nothing of the kind," Cornelius's voice was soft now, deadly. "You're too weak, too confused with laudanum to arrange anything. But I tell you what, if you continue to be difficult, if you continue to threaten me, perhaps I'll include your precious Parthenia in the sale. I know how attached you are to her. It would be a shame to separate you, especially now, when you need her most. But business is business, and I'm sure the Fontaine plantation could use a skilled lady's maid." Silence. Then Sophronia's voice, broken, "You wouldn't. Try me." Parthenia pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself. The hallway tilted and swayed, and for a moment she thought she might be sick. She had known this was possible. Enslaved people lived with this terror every day, the knowledge that they could be sold away from everyone they loved on a white person's whim. But knowing it was possible and hearing it spoken as a casual threat were two different things. She thought of Obadiah, who had their mother's smile and their father's hands, who sang while he worked despite the danger, who had carved a small wooden bird for her last birthday and left it on her pillow. She thought of being sent to Louisiana, to the sugar fields where people were worked to death in a single season and then replaced like broken tools. She thought of the quilt upstairs, waiting. That evening, Parthenia served supper with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped the tureen of soup. Cornelius and Sophronia sat at opposite ends of the long dining table, not speaking, not looking at each other, while Parthenia moved between them like a ghost. The tension in the room was suffocating, thick enough to choke on. When the meal was finally over, Sophronia rose without a word and retired to her chamber, and Parthenia followed. Sophronia was trembling with rage and fear, her thin body shaking as Parthenia helped her undress. "Did you hear?" she asked quietly, and Parthenia realized that Sophronia had known she was listening, had perhaps even wanted her to hear. "Did you hear what he threatened?" "Yes, mistress," Parthenia said, because there was no point in lying. Sophronia turned to face her, and her eyes were wild, fever-bright. "I won't let him do it. I won't let him sell you away. You're mine, do you understand? Mine. I've had you since you were a child. You belong to me." The possessiveness in Sophronia's voice should have been enraging, but Parthenia was beyond rage now. She had passed through rage into something colder, something more focused. "What will you do?" she asked. "I don't know," Sophronia admitted, and for the first time since Parthenia had known her, the mistress looked genuinely helpless. "The documents, I was lying. I have no documents. I have nothing. He could kill me tomorrow and no one would question it. I'm dying anyway, and everyone knows it." She sank onto the bed, her hand going automatically to the quilt folded at its foot. "Sometimes I think this quilt is the only thing keeping me alive. When I'm wrapped in it, I feel protected. As if nothing can touch me." Parthenia said nothing, but she looked at the quilt with new understanding. Of course Sophronia felt protected by it. The quilt had kept her alive this long precisely because it had its own timeline, its own sense of when justice should be administered. It had been waiting for the right moment, and Parthenia was beginning to understand that the right moment might be now, when Sophronia was most afraid, most vulnerable, most aware of her own powerlessness. The quilt would take her when she finally understood what it felt like to be enslaved to circumstances beyond your control. After Sophronia was settled for the night, Parthenia went to find Obadiah. She found him in the quarters, sitting outside the cabin he shared with 6 other young men, carving a piece of wood by lamplight. When he saw her, his face lit up with a smile that made her heart ache. "Sister," he said, standing to embrace her. "I was hoping you'd come. I have something to show you." "Obadiah," she interrupted, gripping his arms. "You're on the list. Master Cornelius is selling 20 people to Louisiana. You're one of them." The joy drained from his face, replaced by an expression that aged him 10 years in an instant. "When?" 2 weeks. He sat down heavily, the piece of wood falling from his hands. "Louisiana," he said quietly. "Mama always said that was worse than hell itself. Said at least in hell, your suffering eventually ends." Parthenia knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers. They were large hands, calloused from field work, but still gentle, still capable of carving birds and whistling tunes. "I won't let it happen," she said, though she had no idea how she would stop it. "How you gonna stop it?" Obadiah asked, echoing her own thoughts. "You're just one woman, and we're just property to them. They do what they want with us, and there ain't nothing we can do about it." But even as he said it, Parthenia was thinking about the quilt, about Jessamyn's words, about the women who had stitched their rage and their power into silk 100 years ago. She was thinking about how sometimes, when you had no power, you had to borrow it from the dead, from the accumulated fury of everyone who had suffered before you. She was thinking about how she might not be able to stop Cornelius, but she could remove one piece from his board, could change the game in ways he would never see coming. "I'll find a way," she told Obadiah, and squeezed his hands. "I promise you, I'll find a way." That night, she returned to the main house to find Sophronia in the grip of a coughing fit so severe that she was choking on her own blood. Parthenia rushed to help her, holding the basin while Sophronia coughed and gasped, her thin body convulsing. When it was finally over, Sophronia lay back against the pillows, exhausted, her lips stained red. "I'm dying," she whispered. "Sooner than I thought. I can feel it." "Hush," Parthenia said, wiping her mistress's face with a cool cloth. "Don't talk like that." "Why shouldn't I?" Sophronia's laugh was bitter. "It's true. And when I'm gone, Cornelius will do whatever he wants. He'll sell you, sell your brother, sell everyone. There'll be no one to stop him. Unless, Parthenia thought, he's too busy dealing with his wife's sudden death to conduct business. Unless grief and shock and the necessary arrangements delay everything. Unless the quilt decides that tonight is finally the night it's been waiting for. Sophronia's hand reached out, grasping Parthenia's wrist with surprising strength. "Promise me something," she said, her eyes desperate. "When I die, and I will die soon, promise me you'll bury me with this quilt. It's the only thing I've ever loved in this house besides you. Promise me." "I promise," Parthenia said, and meant it in ways Sophronia could not understand. She stayed with Sophronia until the mistress fell into a laudanum-heavy sleep, the quilt pulled up to her chin as always. Then Parthenia returned to her room, lay down on her narrow bed, and waited for the house to fall silent around her. She waited while the other servants finished their work and retreated to their quarters. She waited while Cornelius's heavy footsteps passed her door, heading to his own chamber on the other side of the house. She waited while the clock downstairs chimed midnight, then 1, then 2. And then, in the darkest hour before dawn, Parthenia rose, climbed the stairs one last time, and stood outside Sophronia's door with her hand on the latch and her heart full of the borrowed rage of dead women who had waited 100 years for someone like her to finally act. The door opened without a sound. Parthenia had oiled the hinges herself just yesterday, as she did every week, part of the endless maintenance that kept the Blackwell house running. She had not known then why she felt compelled to be so thorough with this particular task, but now she understood. The quilt had been preparing her, guiding her hands, ensuring that when this moment came, nothing would disturb it. The room was thick with August heat despite the open windows. The curtains hung motionless in air that refused to move, as if the night itself were holding its breath. Moonlight spilled across the floor in silver pools, illuminating Sophronia's sleeping form in the four-poster bed. The mistress lay on her back, the quilt pulled up to her chest, her face peaceful in the slack-featured way of the deeply drugged. She had taken extra laudanum tonight, complaining of pain in her chest, of the feeling that something heavy was pressing down on her lungs. Parthenia had measured out the dose herself, perhaps a bit more generous than usual, and had watched Sophronia drink it down with water that Parthenia had fetched from the well. Now she stood at the foot of the bed, watching the rise and fall of Sophronia's chest beneath the quilt, and felt a strange calm settle over her. This was not a decision she was making in this moment. This decision had been made days ago, weeks ago, perhaps even 17 years ago when she was first brought to this house as a child. Every cruelty, every casual violence, every moment of forced intimacy and deliberate humiliation had been leading to this. She was not choosing to kill Sophronia Blackwell. She was simply allowing what had already been set in motion to reach its inevitable conclusion. She moved closer, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The quilt seemed to glow in the moonlight, the embroidered roses appearing almost luminous, and Parthenia could see what she had never noticed before, the patterns were moving. Not dramatically, not obviously, but with a subtle shifting like water disturbed by an unseen current. The faces hidden in the stitching were more visible now, dozens of African women looking up at her with expressions that held no judgment, only recognition. They knew her. They had been waiting for her. They had sewn this moment into the fabric 100 years ago, and now it was finally arriving. Parthenia reached down and grasped the edges of the quilt. It was heavy in her hands, so much heavier than silk and cotton should be, weighted with history and rage and purpose. She lifted it slowly, carefully, and Sophronia did not stir. The laudanum had done its work. The mistress breathed on, oblivious, her lips slightly parted, her hands resting on her stomach. For a long moment, Parthenia simply stood there, holding the quilt above Sophronia's face, and she felt the full weight of what she was about to do. This was murder. This was the ending of a human life, regardless of how cruel that life had been, regardless of how much suffering it had caused. Once she lowered this quilt, once she pressed down and held it there until the breathing stopped, she would be crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. She would be a killer. She would carry this death with her for the rest of her life, however long or short that life might be. But then she thought of Obadiah, of her brother being sold to Louisiana, working to death in the sugar fields before he turned 20. She thought of all the other people whose names Cornelius had written on his list, families that would be torn apart, children who would be sold away from their mothers, husbands separated from wives. She thought of her own mother, who had died without ever being free, who had sewn beautiful things for ugly people until her fingers bled and her eyes went dim. She thought of the women who had made this quilt, who had stitched their power into it knowing they would never live to see it used, but trusting that someday, someone would understand what they had created and would have the courage to use it. She thought of Sophronia saying, "You're mine," as if ownership were love, as if possession were protection. And Parthenia lowered the quilt. It settled over Sophronia's face like a caress, the embroidered silk molding itself to the contours of nose and mouth and chin. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Sophronia breathed in, the fabric pulling tight against her nostrils, and breathed out, the silk billowing slightly. Then her body registered that something was wrong. Her hands came up, not frantically but with the confused slowness of someone drugged, and her fingers tangled in the quilt's edges, trying to push it away. Parthenia pressed down. She pressed down with her burned hand and her unburned hand, with all the strength in her arms and shoulders and back, with the weight of 17 years of servitude, with the accumulated rage of every enslaved person who had ever lived and died on this plantation. She pressed down, and the quilt seemed to help her, seemed to spread itself and mold itself and grow heavier in her hands, as if all the dead women stitched into its fabric were adding their strength to hers. Sophronia's struggles intensified. Her hands clutched at the quilt, pulling, tearing, her fingers scrabbling for purchase on the slippery silk. Her legs kicked out, tangling in the sheets, her heels drumming against the mattress in a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat, fast and panicked. Muffled sounds came from beneath the quilt, not screams, the laudanum and the silk prevented that, but desperate whimpering noises that might have been pleas or might have been prayers or might have been simply the animal sound of a creature fighting for its life. Parthenia held firm. She watched her own hands pressing down on the embroidered roses, saw how the burned scar on her left hand stood out white against her dark skin, a permanent reminder of casual cruelty. She felt Sophronia's face beneath the fabric, felt the press of nose and the desperate puff of breath against her palms, felt the exact moment when the mistress's body understood that this was not a nightmare but death itself arriving. The struggle became more violent. Sophronia's back arched off the bed, her body convulsing with the need for air. One of her hands found Parthenia's wrist and clutched it with desperate strength, nails digging in, drawing blood. For a moment, their eyes met, Parthenia's face visible above the quilt, Sophronia's eyes wide and terrified behind the silk, able to see vague shapes through the weave. In that moment, Parthenia saw recognition dawn in Sophronia's gaze. The mistress knew who was killing her. She knew, and in her eyes was not just fear but something else, something that might have been understanding, or might have been the bitter acknowledgement that this had always been inevitable, that you cannot treat a human being like property for 17 years and not expect consequences. Or perhaps Parthenia imagined it. Perhaps there was nothing in Sophronia's eyes but animal terror and the desperate, dying wish for one more breath. It didn't matter. Parthenia pressed down harder. The struggles grew weaker. Sophronia's hands, which had been clawing at the quilt, began to slow, the movements becoming uncoordinated, purposeless. Her legs stopped kicking and began to twitch instead, small spasms that traveled up her body. The muffled sound ceased. The only noise in the room was Parthenia's own breathing, harsh and quick, and the distant sound of frogs singing down by the river, indifferent to the death occurring in the big house on the bluff. Parthenia felt the moment life left Sophronia's body. It was not dramatic. There was no final convulsion, no last desperate surge of strength. Instead, there was simply a gradual cessation, a slow unwinding like a clock running down. The tension left Sophronia's muscles. Her hands, which had been gripping Parthenia's wrist, relaxed and fell away. Her chest, which had been heaving in futile attempts to draw breath through silk and suffocation, grew still. The body beneath the quilt became just that, a body, an empty vessel, a thing that had once housed a person but now housed only the fact of death. Parthenia held the quilt in place for a long time after, counting slowly to 100, then to 200, making sure. Making absolutely certain. When she finally lifted the quilt away, Sophronia's face was peaceful. The laudanum had been a mercy in that way, death had come in a fog of confusion rather than full awareness. The mistress's eyes were closed, her lips slightly parted, her face pale but not contorted. She looked like she had simply fallen asleep and failed to wake up, which was exactly how it needed to look. Parthenia set the quilt aside and stood there, staring down at what she had done. Her hands were shaking now, trembling so violently she had to clasp them together to make them still. She waited for guilt to crash over her, for horror at her own actions, for the weight of mortal sin to press down on her soul. But what she felt instead was a strange lightness, as if she had set down a burden she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. She felt empty. She felt calm. She felt like she had finally, after 17 years, done something that mattered. She moved with practiced efficiency then, arranging everything just so. She lifted Sophronia's body slightly, smoothing the nightgown, arranging the arms at her sides in a natural sleeping position. She closed the mistress's mouth, gently, with her thumbs. She took the quilt and spread it carefully over Sophronia's body, tucking it around her shoulders and smoothing the embroidered roses so they lay flat and perfect. To anyone who entered this room, it would look like Sophronia Blackwell had died peacefully in her sleep, wrapped in the heirloom quilt she loved, taken by the consumption that everyone knew would claim her soon anyway. Parthenia stood back and examined her work with a critical eye. Everything looked right. Natural. Inevitable. She walked around the room, checking for anything out of place. The laudanum bottle sat on the nightstand, good, that would explain the deep sleep. The windows were open, good, fresh air for the invalid, just as the doctor had recommended. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no indication of anything but a quiet death in the night. She picked up the basin she had used earlier when Sophronia was coughing, the water still pink with blood. She would empty it, wash it, and return it to its place. She collected the cloth she had used to wipe Sophronia's face. She moved through the room like the efficient servant she had been trained to be, erasing any evidence of her presence, any suggestion that this night had been different from any other night. Before she left, she returned to the bedside one final time. She looked down at Sophronia's face, peaceful in death in a way it had never been in life, and felt something complicated move through her chest. Not regret, exactly. Not satisfaction either. Just a profound awareness that everything had changed, that she had changed, that she could never return to being the woman she had been when she entered this room. "You said I was yours," Parthenia whispered to the corpse. "But I never was. I never belonged to anyone but myself." She reached down and adjusted the quilt one final time, her fingers trailing over the embroidered roses. The fabric felt warm beneath her touch, almost alive, and she could have sworn she heard those voices again, women singing in harmony, a song of triumph and sorrow intertwined. The faces hidden in the stitching seemed to smile at her, welcoming her into their number, acknowledging that she had done what they had hoped someone would do when they created this deadly beautiful thing 100 years ago. Then Parthenia walked to the door, turned back once to survey the room with its sleeping mistress who would never wake, and slipped out into the hallway, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like the closing of a chapter, the ending of a story, the final punctuation on a sentence that had taken 17 years to write. She went to the kitchen, washed the basin and her hands, and returned to her small room. She lay down on her narrow bed and waited for dawn, listening to her own heartbeat, steady and strong and alive, and feeling the weight of what she had done settle into her bones where it would live forever, neither forgiven nor forgotten, simply done. Parthenia discovered the body at dawn, just as she did every morning when she came to wake the mistress. Her scream brought the entire household running, Cornelius stumbling from his chamber half-dressed, old Jessamine hurrying up from the kitchen, other servants clustering in the hallway with expressions that ranged from shock to a carefully hidden satisfaction. Parthenia played her part perfectly, weeping over Sophronia's still form, clutching the mistress's cold hand, calling her name as if she could wake the dead through sheer desperation. No one suspected. Why would they? The consumption had been killing Sophronia for 2 years. Everyone had been waiting for this death. It was only surprising that it had not come sooner. The doctor arrived from Memphis by midday, examined the body, and pronounced it a natural death. The consumption had finally claimed her, he said, probably a hemorrhage in the lungs during the night, quick and painless thanks to the laudanum. He commended Parthenia for her devoted care, noted how peacefully the deceased looked wrapped in her beloved heirloom quilt, and signed the death certificate without hesitation. Cornelius accepted the news with what appeared to be genuine grief, though Parthenia saw the flash of relief in his eyes when the doctor confirmed there would be no investigation, no questions, no complications. The funeral was held 3 days later, a grand affair with half of Memphis society in attendance, all of them remarking on how tragic it was that such a young woman had been taken, how devoted her husband had been, and how faithful her servants were. Parthenia stood at the back of the church in her mourning dress, a black garment that had belonged to Sophronia and still smelled faintly of lavender and sickness, and watched them bury her mistress in the family plot overlooking the river. True to her promise, she had ensured that Sophronia was buried with the quilt, wrapped in it like a shroud, the embroidered roses visible even through the glass-topped casket. Let the quilt go into the ground with its victim, she thought. Let it rest, its purpose fulfilled. But the quilt had other plans. 2 weeks after the funeral, Cornelius called Parthenia to his study. She went with her heart in her throat, certain that he had somehow discovered the truth, that he was going to accuse her or sell her or worse. Instead, he told her that in recognition of her devoted service to his late wife, he was reassigning her from house duties. She would no longer serve as a lady's maid. Instead, she would work in the weaving house with the other women, a significant demotion that nevertheless meant she would no longer be trapped in the suffocating intimacy of personal service. The sale of enslaved people, he added almost as an afterthought, had been postponed indefinitely due to his period of mourning. Obadiah would stay. They would all stay, at least for now. Parthenia should have felt relief. She should have felt triumph. But instead, as she left Cornelius's study, she felt only a creeping sense of unease, as if something were unfinished, as if the quilt's work were not yet complete. That night, she dreamed of suffocation. She dreamed of silk pressed against her face, of embroidered roses filling her mouth and nose, of women's voices singing in languages she did not know. She woke up gasping, clawing at her throat, and found her small room unbearably hot despite the cool October air outside. When she finally fell back into fitful sleep, she dreamed again, this time of Sophronia's face beneath the quilt, those wide eyes staring up at her, but when she looked closer, the eyes were not Sophronia's but her own, reflected back as if the quilt were a mirror showing her what she had become. The dreams continued. Every night, Parthenia woke up choking, convinced that something was pressing down on her chest, stealing her breath. She began to dread sleep, and began to pace her small room until exhaustion forced her into unconsciousness. During the day, she worked in the weaving house with the other women, her hands moving mechanically through the familiar motions of thread and loom, but her mind was elsewhere, trapped in that moment when she had pressed down on the quilt and felt life leave Sophronia's body beneath her hands. 2 months after Sophronia's death, the first whisper began. One of the field hands, a young man named Phineas, was found dead in his cabin, seemingly suffocated in his sleep. There were no marks on his body, no signs of violence, but his face was twisted in an expression of terror, and several people reported seeing him the night before carrying something silk and embroidered that he had found near the cemetery. Old Jessamine said nothing, but her eyes met Parthenia's across the yard, and Parthenia knew that the cook understood. The quilt had not stayed buried with Sophronia. It had returned. 3 weeks later, the overseer died in similar fashion, found in his bed with his face purple and his eyes bulging, though the doctor insisted it was his heart. But Parthenia had seen the silk threads caught under his fingernails, the faint pattern of roses pressed into the skin of his face. The quilt was choosing its victims, working its way through those who had perpetuated suffering, administering its patient justice. Then, a year after Sophronia's death, Cornelius remarried. The new bride was named Lavinia Tate, a widow from Nashville with considerable property of her own and a daughter from her first marriage. She was 40 years old, practical rather than beautiful, and she came to the Blackwell plantation with clear eyes and firm ideas about how things should be run. Within a month, she had dismissed the old overseer's replacement and hired a new one who did not use the whip so freely. She ordered better rations for the quarters and insisted that families not be separated in any future sales. She was not kind, she was still a mistress, still a slaveholder, but she was less cruel than Sophronia had been, and for that, the enslaved people of the plantation found themselves in the uncomfortable position of feeling something almost like gratitude toward their new owner. Lavinia took possession of Sophronia's old chamber, and on her first night there, she asked Parthenia about the heirloom quilt. She had heard it was a family treasure, she said, and wanted to know why it had been buried with the last mistress. Parthenia's blood ran cold as she explained that it had been Sophronia's dying wish. Lavinia nodded thoughtfully, then mentioned that it was curious because she could have sworn she had seen such a quilt in the attic just yesterday, wrapped in muslin and stored with the other linens. Parthenia went to the attic that evening, her hands shaking as she climbed the narrow stairs. And there it was, the quilt, folded neatly on a shelf, the embroidered roses as vivid as the day it was made, not a speck of dirt on it despite having supposedly been buried for a year. She reached out to touch it, and the silk was warm beneath her fingers, almost feverishly hot, and she heard those voices again, singing their endless song. The quilt had not stayed in the grave. It had called itself back, had returned to the house to continue its work, and Parthenia understood with a sick certainty that it would never be finished. The rage stitched into it was too vast, the suffering too deep. It would claim victim after victim, generation after generation, and she had become part of its legacy, another woman whose violence had fed its power. She tried to warn Lavinia without revealing too much, suggested that perhaps the quilt should be destroyed, burned, anything but used. But Lavinia laughed and said it was far too valuable to destroy, such exquisite needlework, such history. She had it placed on her bed that very night. Parthenia waited for the new mistress to die, but weeks passed and Lavinia slept peacefully under the quilt, waking each morning refreshed and cheerful. The quilt, it seemed, had judged her and found her not yet worthy of its attention. Or perhaps it was simply patient, waiting as it had always waited, knowing that time would reveal the truth about everyone who slept beneath it. The years passed. Parthenia grew older, her hands developing the calluses and stiffness of age, her hair showing threads of gray. Obadiah married and had children, and Parthenia became an aunt, finding joy in small faces that looked like her mother's. The war came and went, bringing chaos and change and finally, impossibly, freedom. The emancipation came and Parthenia could have left, could have walked away from the Blackwell plantation and never looked back. But she stayed, partly because she had nowhere else to go, partly because Lavinia offered her wages and a cottage of her own, and partly because she could not abandon the quilt. She had become its keeper, its guardian. She alone knew what it was, what it could do, what it had done. She alone could sense when it was growing restless, when it was calling for blood. She watched as Cornelius died, not by the quilt's hand but by a stroke that left him drooling and helpless before finally releasing him. She watched as Lavinia aged gracefully, dying at 70 in her sleep, and her daughter inherited the plantation. She watched as the quilt was passed down through generations of Blackwell women, some of whom died young and some of whom lived long lives, and she came to understand that the quilt had its own sense of justice that was inscrutable and absolute. Now, in her 60th year, Parthenia sits in the chamber of the current Blackwell mistress, a great-great-granddaughter of Cornelius and his first wife, and runs her fingers over the quilt's surface. The embroidered roses are as vivid as ever, untouched by time, and the faces hidden in the stitching seem to wink at her in the lamplight. She is the only person alive who knows the quilt's true history, who understands the power woven into its silk. The young mistress sleeping beneath it treats Parthenia with respect, pays her fairly, calls her Miss Parthenia instead of just her Christian name. Perhaps the quilt will spare this one. Perhaps not. That is not for Parthenia to decide. What she knows is this: she killed Sophronia Blackwell with this quilt 52 years ago, and she has been bound to it ever since. She is part of its history now, another thread woven into its pattern, another voice added to its chorus. The quilt will outlast her, will outlast them all, patient and beautiful and deadly, waiting for the next woman who is desperate enough and angry enough to understand what it offers and brave enough to use it. Some nights, Parthenia still dreams of that moment, the weight of the quilt in her hands, the struggle beneath the silk, the final stillness. Some nights, she wakes choking, certain that the quilt has finally turned its attention to her, that she will be its next victim, claimed by the very weapon she once wielded. But morning always comes, and the quilt remains folded at the foot of someone else's bed, and Parthenia remains alive, carrying her terrible secret, the last living witness to murder disguised as mercy, violence disguised as justice. She knows she will die soon. She can feel it in her bones, the way winter comes on. And when she dies, the quilt's true history will die with her, or so she thinks. But the quilt knows its own story, holds it in every stitch, and it will tell that story to whoever has ears to hear, whoever has rage enough to listen, whoever has courage enough to use it when the time comes. The quilt is patient. It has always been patient. It will wait as long as it needs to, beautiful and terrible and eternal, a legacy of rage passed down through generations, waiting for the next desperate hand to lift it, the next suffocating night, the next reckoning that is long overdue. Thank you for watching this chilling tale from America's dark past. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe and let me know in the comments what historical horror you'd like me to uncover next. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.